Welcome to the last session of Symposium related to the exhibition Surrealism Beyond Borders. I'm Matthew Gale, Senior Curator at Large at Tate Modern, and on behalf of Stephanie D'Alessandro, Venade Lauder, Curator of Modern Art at Met, we'd like to thank all of those presenters who worked on the programme, all of those who participated in the discussions and in the preparations to put this programme together, as well as all of you who have joined us, shared your thoughts, and contributed your questions. In this last session, we've invited our moderators, Joan, Zita Nunes, and Joan Adès, to come together for a summary conversation. It will be guided by questions that have been prompted by the exhibition and emerged through the symposium. Joan, Zita, and Dawn, thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Matthew, for your introduction. And again, to reiterate, thanks to all the participants, including you, our valuable audience members. The first question I had was really just a very general one of sort of a where are we now question. So throughout the panels, there has been, and also in the exhibition, there's been a certain kind of internalized politics in thinking about why surrealism now, why revisit it now at this juncture, at this scale. And it seems like it's in many ways motivated by a certain kind of desire to incorporate some of the political issues that we grapple with right now in 2022. So I'm wondering, I'm just interested to hear from my fellow panelists how they think of that relationship between surrealism as this historical phenomenon and some of the other sort of more current or present concerns that seem to animate the investment in this kind of scholarship now.
Well, I think I'll begin, and I'll also begin with thank yous to Matthew and Stephanie and the team that organized the exhibition and provided the opportunity for the kinds of conversations and provocations over the last 2 days that I think if there's a takeaway for me from this program is, you know, how wonderful it, like to think of the this exhibition in a kind of a surrealist way in terms of a process, like to begin with these kinds of conversations that raise and hash out the issues that have been discussed over the past 2 days. And so it's a fantastic opportunity to think through these issues. And also the audience for being here and for their questions. So, you know, I mean, I think maybe I'll start answering the question by referring to the map, the Surrealist map that has served as a kind of touchstone over several of the presentations. And there's a kind of worlding that takes place through that map. And there's something that gives us a certain frisson at the idea of the decentering of Europe and sort of the erasure of the United States. But that map also, in erasing the United States, erases Black Americans, right? And like thinking today, yesterday, Mitch McConnell made this comment about how African Americans are voting at the same rate as Americans, which like refers back to Du Bois's question at the beginning of the 20th century: is it possible to be Black and American at the same time? And so I think, you know, surrealism, you know, as we've been discussing it, it has, come forth as a language and a way of life. I think, Dawn, at the beginning of your panel, you recalled the importance of, in thinking of, addressing surrealism in exhibition context, surrealist exhibitions and exhibitions about surrealism. And I think that this exhibition, along with this conversation, is inviting us to think about surrealist exhibitions and thinking in terms of the surrealist, insofar as the sort of networks and the possibilities of entering in different places and tracing those networks in ways that help us to rethink our relationships to archives, as Sam reminded us in the last session. The importance of engaging with the archive each time returning to it, having learned to see in different ways, sometimes provoked by precisely the kind of interventions that he called attention to in his work, in his own artistic and curatorial practice. So, like, remembering that these, what has been described as the elected affinities among surrealists are not always elected, but sometimes uncomfortably accepted or embraced or adopted, because surrealism is only one of several languages or threads or contexts in which any artist, writer, musician, we might encompass within our understanding of the surrealist, or within a conversation about surrealism. And just to give an example before moving on, so that perhaps Dawn could follow up on this herself, is to think about networks in a range of ways. So, for example, Malangatana from Mozambique exhibited one of his very famous paintings, which is at MoMA, called The Cry of Freedom at Festac, the second World Exhibition Festival of Arts and Culture in Lagos, Nigeria. And on the back of it, he dedicated the painting to Eduardo Mondlane and Amilcar Cabral, two revolutionaries, and there were dates before, during, and after independence. And so in that object, there is sort of the past, present, the future, entangled in, and then exhibited in a space that connects to Ted Jones and Jane Quartet, who will, are also linked to surrealism, but whose networks are also, connected to to other contexts and other movements. And so I guess, my thinking about, I want to stop here and then come back to some other ideas about how we do this, is that this story can't be told one time and one way. This exhibition, as we've learned, is, in conversation and dialogue with others that have come before and others that will come after, because it's a very complex story of, chance coming together, coming apart, revisiting and renewed and different understanding, a refusal of stasis and of like linear time as has been described. And so just to get back to your original question, why surrealism, why now? These commitments to justice, to freedom, but also to networks, to an ethical sort of relationship to the world and to others are, like it's a conversation that has been ongoing within the Surrealist as well as Surrealism.
It's a very good question. Thank you, Zita, for that wonderful reply. I'm just thinking again about the map, the map of the world in the time of the Surrealists, which so many of us have. Oh, sorry, hang on. Oh, I'm not muted. So many of us have referred to, and how important it is to remember that, that time has a shape, if you like, and this, or if you like, geography is shaped by time as it is in that map. And we might imagine that map today, which would be very, very different from the map that that they produced in 1929. And as you quite rightly say, the United States it just isn't there. So what about African American population? Well, you have to think about it, I suppose, in terms of politics of the time. And from the Surrealist perspective, it would be seen as a kind of, the absence of the United States, like the absence of France and Great Britain, were the absences of the three great colonial powers. So now if we rephrased it, I'm thinking about this last session today was devoted to the question of time, surrealism and time, and I think it's interesting to sort of think about the way that the way that time has a geographical shape. This is actually demonstrated very nicely in an essay by Max Maurice in La Révolution Surréaliste, called The Itinerary of Time. And it's an itinerary of time from prehistory to the present. And he writes as follows: prehistory begins in the Massif Central. Thence, by devious and imprecise routes, wandering over the Asiatic continent, time, with a capital T, passes through Troy on its way to the west, reaches Greece in the 5th century BC, and in the year 0 appears in Rome. Well, this obviously is a totally Eurocentric view of time, but it's interesting in the way that it gives you a sort of shape of time travels through geographies. And I was just sort of thinking about the way that a surrealist map, a map of the world, the present day, from a surrealist perspective, would be different. I'd like to know what others think about that and how it might change. But I would imagine that, for example, places that are under terrible threat from expropriation, exploitation, and general degradation, like the Amazon and like parts of Sumatra and so on, would figure very largely, because I think the surrealists would be very much, or are very much, alert to the problems that progress, if you like, and the assumption that, the assumption that the doctrine of progress and the progress of civilization are necessary. That doctrine is actually outmoded and needs to be challenged in order to address things like the climate crisis. So I'm saying that there are now pressing issues which I think in some respects the surrealists showed us the way to. I'm thinking about the famous essay by Perret called La nature dévore le progrès et le dépasse. And I think that is, that's an area we haven't really touched on very much yet. We've talked in all the general terms about the problem of assumptions about what progress means. But I think today it has to be addressed in a much more wholehearted and environmentally conscious way.
Joan, did you want to follow up on your own question, or?
I have lots of questions, but
no, I mean, did you want to address your own question? Like, did you have something you wanted to say about it?
Yeah, one of the questions I've always had was, is it possible to have, say, a counter-colonial history of surrealism? So if, say, if surrealism is inherently a movement that takes on board political urgencies, regardless of when the urgency took root, how is it possible to have a counter-colonial history of surrealism? So going off of both your engagement with the idea of a map, what would it be like to have a map that self-destructs? I mean, I don't know what that would look like. So if you, say, clicked on a part of the world, it would suddenly kind of just disintegrate in not only identifications of movements or ideas, but also in thinking about sort of my pet project translation, where how is it that the translation actually it becomes illegible to, say, others who may have been referencing that kind of text, so that the map self-destructs by turning into basically all these different kinds of unreadable texts, or poems working at cross purposes, or people who may not have known each other in the flesh, but how is it that debates over a particular term? I'm thinking about for example, the idea of the unconscious, which sometimes gets translated as the subconscious or the or subterranean conscious. That how are these kinds of terms subject to all of this sort of fragmentation, so that the map we eventually end up with becomes just these collection of little data bytes or data points. I really enjoyed your both your interrogations about the map, because I'm thinking, what would it be like to have a self-exploding map, which to me seems to be central to the Surrealist project. And I see that project as continuing to the present day.
So, it's funny because on your first panel, I felt like there were other models that were presented that were not the map. And one of them, I think it was Christoph, who followed his discussion of the map with the discussion of the labyrinth and the maze. And I wonder if what could happen is the labyrinth or the maze with various entrances that start from different points or different orientations. And he spoke about the utopia as the empty center, and that the center would be empty, unreachable, and that these paths would create different ways of moving through space and time to engage in with the surrealist practices, surrealist ways of life, but also artifacts that lead perhaps to similar ends, but arrive in different ways and have to be this movement remade by entering in different places and different times. And one way that happened was through Fahima Ife in their sort of performance of surrealism in a way that's engaged with space, with time, with surrealism in the present, with linking with the past, and also through a range of citational practices. Also, it's the archive, but it's also our citational practices. There's been a lot of calling out of names and developing a kind of set of resources who are central, and, or I don't want to use the word central, but who are critical for our understandings of surrealism in the past and in the present.
Dawn, would you like to follow up on that, or should we bring up some other questions?
You have another question?
I mean, I cede the floor to either both of you.
Oh.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'll be here forever. So,
well,
question. Yes.
Okay, so we were provided with some, I thought, really great questions by the curators of the exhibit to help us kind of think back over the course of the conversation over the past couple of days. And there've been a request for us to think about what we've learned about the movement of surrealism and its recounting, sort of its institutionalization, the factors involving translation, but also a question about incommensurability and in terms of language, cultural, social, temporal incommensurability. And the curators asked if this is productive, like that, can incommensurability be productive? And so I'd like to put that question out to the two of you. Like, how does the notion of incommensurability, which has been a thread through the conversations, like, is it productive? Is it a problem?
Can you define a little bit more closely how you understand incommensurable? I mean, are we talking about measuring, huge numbers of different sort of languages, systems, cultures against each other? Or...
So what I understood by this question is that there are for example, in the case of translation, in the impossibility to fully translate, there are always something that will be left over or that cannot be translated. And in bringing together, if in the space of the exhibition, but also in a discussion of surrealism, different languages, different trajectories, different histories, different sets of relationships, different sense of being, of taking on the category of surrealism or not, that there is a gap, and how do we navigate, and should we navigate that gap or how do we navigate that gap in thinking and talking about surrealism?
Yes, I may be quite wrong, but I think it could be linked to another very interesting question that Stephanie brought to my attention, to do with, one of the participants said, well, the presentations have been, although quite general, how does one deal with particularities of time and place and history with surrealism, and how do we move between these very specific things and the details and the larger picture, and also, as you say, the problem of translating from one to the other? And I quite honestly don't know the answer, but because I'm not sure there is one, but it's one that is now raised by this exhibition in ways that I think open up open up possibilities rather than closing them down by trying to box everything in to too tight a set of criteria and too clear a kind of taxonomy. I think that keeping things as extraordinarily open and fluid as they can be, in the way that, you know, everybody's experience is, the operations of chance are. I think that means it shouldn't be something that is fearful, but something that is welcomed.
Joan?
Yeah, I have kind of two minds about this. So on the one hand, the idea of, say, incommensurability, I think, is a really kind of powerful argument against the institutionalization of the global as it's now being used. For me, the global is, it hasn't really divorced itself from the 19th century European concept of a world literature. So, you know, one is that Goethe coins the term in 1827, and he has this idealistic vision that it'll lead to some kind of synthesis, that it will lead to fewer world wars. But what that also does is that it tends to gloss over some of the frictions that are inherent in, say, mistranslation. So, you know, one of the questions I've always been interested in with translation is, why are certain words repeatedly privileged over others? And who wins when a particular word? So, for example, just speaking out of my own backyard in Korea, that why is it that the Romanized word for surrealism was initially privileged over its Korean cognate? And what did that say, one, about the value systems of the time, but two, that having native Korean speakers try to trip over a word that wasn't their own, you know, again, what does that also say about whose voices are actually privileged in a certain context? And I feel that incommensurability sheds light on this. And, I think one of the issues that you tacitly raise is that there is a difference between incommensurability as an abstraction versus incommensurability in practice. So the difficulty of actually trying to figure out which words are able to convey. Do we choose between the words that are able to convey the attitude that we project or we believe the author is trying to convey, or do we choose the more literal term, which is, again, something that many of us who work with translation always we always have to kind of think about. And so I'm wondering also in your question that maybe it's also a provocation towards the extent to which globalism attempts to incorporate or co-opt incommensurability in order to justify what it is that it's trying to set out, which is, again, in some ways trying to gloss over these very real and, ongoing differences that may not get a lot of airtime because it's not glamorous. How many people really care about Romanized surrealism versus surrealism and translated in a particular language? And it's not a glamorous topic by any means, but those sorts of root questions are really at the basis of the incommensurability as a practice, which I think your question brings up so beautifully.
Yeah, and I think that incommensurability is, it's not a problem to be solved, but a problem to be kind of worked with, because it keeps open the recognition that one cannot fully know, and that you're sort of reaching out to this image of incorporation, like it keeps open the knowledge that work has to be done. Like I'm always keep in mind the words of a poet, M. Norbezi Philip, who says, I want to write about the beauty of kinky hair and broad noses. And then she says, well, maybe I should be writing about the language that kinked the hair and broadened the noses. So that incommensurability, like it's like to acknowledge and to make that part of the process of thinking through these categories, like that we are working with.
Do we have time, do you think, to look at one more of the questions that, that Stephanie proposed to us, which in a sense follows on from that, I think, which is, has our session led to new ideas about how to define or understand surrealism? Let's say the symposium. Has the symposium led to new ideas about how to define it, or
from my perspective, I feel as though the conversations have like opened up the, I think what I said before, that there are so many ways to enter into the story of the surrealist and surrealism, and how much research recovery work and revisiting that this exhibition is an important part of, but also how it opens, I think, on to what I hope is continued revisiting of and rearranging of what we think we know, what we are learning about surrealism with a capital S and surrealism with a small s.
And one thing came out of my session this afternoon, well, many things did, but one particular thing from an artist, Sam Durant, which was, for him, we all know, we all insisted, a great deal on the fact that surrealism is not a style, but art, it is not a style. It has no, that is not relevant, although that is the way that other art movements are defined in the 20th century and 21st century. Surrealism does not have a style. What does it do instead? Well, it encourages you to explore and research and investigate archives and go out and explore. And it seems to me that is still one of the most important aspects of surrealism, and contemporary surrealism in a way is showing us how extraordinarily alive and potential all that kind of attention still is. That the need to experiment and to explore within surrealism, following various practices, following various activities, but nothing actually laid down in law, as it were, in surrealist principles. It is endlessly renewing, and looking at the work that has been uncovered in this exhibition, it's extraordinarily how new and diverse so much of it is, and how it goes on opening up new avenues of experience and new ideas.
Joan, do you want to have the last word?
Yeah, no, I mean, one sort of question I also was wondering about is, again, why surrealism was so long-lived. And we're thinking about, both your interventions, that in some ways it is because it's a negotiation where agreement is in fact not the goal. And so how is it that the breakdown of resolutions allows us to think about figuring artworks as ways of viewing the world rather than as figures to be viewed? And I felt that transition was very much present in this particular exhibition, whereas there have been other exhibitions where it was, here's a work, we all look at it, we think of a particular historical moment, and then we move on. And I'm also wondering, just thinking about Dawn and your responses as well, is why is it that surrealism often coincides with situations of extreme political crisis? And it's not necessarily because they're symptoms of those situations, but these are works that are really foregrounding what it actually means to be close, which is sometimes mistaken for intimacy, that there is actually a difference between being close and being intimate, being distant and being alienated. And how is it that these distortions are actually truer to what we might want the world to eventually be than what is currently assumed. So that's.
Thank you. We've run out of time, and so I just want to thank my co-panelists for this conversation, and again, the organizers for the opportunity to take part in this symposium.
I want to thank each of you so much, Joan, Zita, Dawn. Thank you for concluding our program and for your moderation of the 3 sessions. On behalf of Stephanie D'Alessandro, Matthew Gale, and myself, heartfelt thanks to each of you, to all of our speakers for their contributions to the program, and for a series of really fascinating presentations and such a rich exchange of ideas. Our thanks also goes to additional contributors to earlier conversations about the program, to Ryan Johnston, Hannah McHale, for all of their work behind the scenes over the last few days, and all of our collaborators at the Met and Tate Modern. Thank you to all of you for joining us over the last couple of days. We so appreciate your participation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
Mariana. Thank you.